behind the neoclassical walls of South Africa Parliament in Cape Town lies Section 58 of the Constitution, an absolute legal fortress that shields parliamentarians from defamation, civil lawsuits, and criminal prosecution for any statement uttered within the legislative chamber. Yet while millions of ordinary citizens must answer to the unyielding weight of the justice system, the foundational dignity of constitutional democracy is systematically undermined when lawmakers exploit parliamentary immunity to weaponize racial hostility. When personal vitriol displaces public duty from the very seat of power, the fragile boundary between democratic privilege and systemic impunity completely dissolves. If a nation has the vote but not the voice, is it truly a democracy? Stay with South African dynamics. This is far more than a routine parliamentary dispute. It is a decisive hinge in the modern history of African governance. If you value rigorous, fearless investigations that dissect political power and uphold human dignity, take a moment right now. Like this broadcast, leave your perspective in the comments below and subscribe to our channel to walk with us through this unfolding story. The National Assembly in Cape Town stands as one of the most solemn architectural monuments on the African continent. Within this grand chamber beneath the polished timber and the national crest, the collective destiny of over 60 million citizens is meant to be debated, forged, and protected. It was conceived to be the supreme sanctuary of constitutional governance. Yet on an ordinary legislative afternoon, this very chamber was transformed into an arena of raw, unfiltered racial antagonism. The confrontation began not over sweeping economic legislation or urgent public policy, but over an elementary question of procedural order. When Julius Malema, the commander-in-chief of the economic freedom fighters, rose to address the presiding officer Speaker Khumbudzo Ntshavheni, he casually bypassed long-standing parliamentary custom by addressing her directly by her first name. It was an unmistakable departure from the formal decorum that governs Commonwealth legislative bodies. Rising from the benches of the governing African National Congress veteran parliamentarian Cameron Dugmore raised a point of order, reminding the House that such informal language undermined the institutional authority of the presiding chair. In any mature constitutional democracy, a point of order regarding decorum is resolved through a swift ruling from the Speaker, followed by a brief retraction and the continuation of state business. But inside South Africa Parliament, where unresolved historical grievances simmer perpetually close to the surface, procedural propriety quickly became collateral damage. Rather than acknowledging the established conventions of the House, Julius Malema turned his full rhetorical force directly toward Cameron Dugmore. What followed was not a measured legal counterargument on parliamentary jurisprudence, but an immediate and aggressive personal onslaught directed squarely at Dugmore's racial identity and historical standing. Within moments, the focus of the supreme lawmaking body shifted entirely away from governance, plunging into an unsparing confrontation that laid bare the profound fragility of democratic accountability across the nation. To understand why such conduct can unfold without immediate legal intervention, one must examine the constitutional architecture that surrounds every elected representative in Cape Town. Under Section 58 of the South African Constitution, members of Parliament enjoy absolute privileges and immunities. This clause was originally drafted with the noble intent of safeguarding legislators from authoritarian overreach, ensuring that elected representatives could question ministers and expose state corruption without fear of arrest, civil lawsuits, or criminal defamation. However, an institutional shield originally designed for public protection has increasingly been converted into a private sanctuary for character assassination. While an ordinary citizen outside those heavy oak doors would face immediate civil liability and severe legal penalties for public defamation and targeted harassment, lawmakers inside the chamber operate behind an almost impenetrable legal fortress. This shield of legislative immunity exists alongside a staggering socioeconomic divide that deepens the public sense of betrayal. Every member of Parliament receives an annual salary exceeding 2 million rand, complemented by state-funded travel privileges, official residences, and a sprawling security apparatus known as the VIP Protection Unit, whose annual budget surpasses 3 billion rand. Outside these fortified walls, more than 28 million South Africans depend on monthly social relief grants simply to survive, while the expanded unemployment rate exceeds 42%. In this deeply unequal landscape, the seat of power has become dangerously detached from the daily realities of the people. The chamber, which ought to model national dignity and constitutional stewardship, increasingly resembles an insular political stage where politicians trade vitriol with complete immunity from the harsh economic struggles faced by the electorate. Yet the true gravity of this parliamentary clash extends far beyond broken rules of order or lavish political perks. As the presiding officers struggled to maintain control over the escalating chamber, Julius Malema's rhetoric crossed a decisive threshold, moving beyond ideological disagreement into explicit personal insults targeting skin tone liberation credentials and human dignity. But what happens when an elected leader does not merely test parliamentary decorum, but deliberately uses racial identity to dismantle the legitimacy of a fellow lawmaker before the national cameras? As Cameron Dugmore completed his intervention, the atmosphere inside the National Assembly hardened instantly. What unfolded next was an extraordinary display of combative political theatre and calculated personal denigration. Julius Malema seized the microphone, casting aside every norm of legislative decorum. In a blistering address that reverberated throughout the chamber, Malema proclaimed that he possessed no respect for white supremacists, asserting that while others might accept subservience within party structures, he would never tolerate patronizing lectures. He then turned his full rhetorical focus directly upon Dugmore's physical appearance, drawing explicit attention to his skin tone, burned from the sun, branding him a bloody racist, a racist of note, and declaring with contempt that he refused to be subjected to what he dismissed as a clown. This was not a measured ideological disagreement over public policy or constitutional principles. It was an unrestrained assault on individual dignity delivered from the very heart of the Republic's supreme lawmaking institution. For millions of citizens watching the national broadcast, the exchange demonstrated how rapidly public duty could be subordinated to racial animus. When the presiding officer instructed Malema to withdraw his unparliamentary language, the response was a masterclass in tactical evasion. Rather than offering an unconditional retraction or showing institutional deference, Malema executed a calculated linguistic maneuver. He agreed to withdraw the word racist, yet stubbornly insisted that Cameron Dugmore remained a white supremacist, claiming that such an accusation was entirely permissible within parliamentary rules. By manipulating procedural technicalities, he effectively preserved the full weight of the insult while evading formal censure. This moment brought into sharp focus a fundamental constitutional friction: accountability versus impunity. In a fragile democracy, the preservation of the rule of law requires decisive structural integrity. Not reform, not rhetoric, accountability. When internal disciplinary bodies hesitate and parliamentary standing orders are treated as negotiable suggestions, legislative privilege ceases to be a safeguard for free speech and becomes a weapon of untouchable political authority. To fully understand the gravity of these accusations, one must examine the historical record that Julius Malema sought to dismiss. Cameron Dugmore's political journey was not forged in contemporary privilege, but in the dangerous underground resistance against the apartheid state. Recruited into the underground structures of the African National Congress. In 1986, Dugmore formally dedicated his political life to the liberation movement in 1991. At a time when standing against the apartheid regime meant facing severe state surveillance detention and social ostracism from his own community, Dugmore chose multiracial solidarity and the cause of democratic liberation over racial entitlement. To casually invalidate these historical sacrifices and question his credentials is a deliberate attempt to rewrite the collective memory of the anti-apartheid struggle for immediate political advantage. It reduces decades of principled resistance against state tyranny into narrow, polarizing caricatures. Yet the most profound institutional paradox of this entire confrontation lies not merely in the words spoken on the parliamentary floor, but in where Julius Malema sits within the broader constitutional architecture of the state. Beyond his role as an opposition party leader, Malema occupies a coveted seat on the Judicial Service Commission, the premier constitutional body tasked with interviewing, vetting, and recommending the appointment of judges to the High Court and the Constitutional Court of South Africa. Here lies a staggering institutional contradiction. A political figure who repeatedly disrupts parliamentary order and tests the boundaries of constitutional decorum holds direct constitutional authority over the very judiciary charged with interpreting the laws of the land. It is a reality that raises profound questions regarding judicial independence and institutional oversight. When the highest disciplinary committees of Parliament fail to sanction conduct that would result in immediate legal consequences for an ordinary citizen, the moral authority of the entire legislative framework is called into question. But does this unchecked rhetoric reflect an isolated parliamentary failure, or does it expose a far deeper institutionalized double standard in how justice and dignity are administered across the nation? The stark disparity between parliamentary privilege and the legal reality faced by ordinary citizens outside Parliament exposes a profound fracture within South Africa's judicial landscape. When an everyday citizen engages in public racial insults or defamatory conduct, the full machinery of the legal system descends rapidly and decisively. Consider the landmark legal precedent of Vicky Momberg, a former real estate agent who was sentenced to an effective term of direct imprisonment for crime and injuria following an egregious racial tirade against law enforcement officers. The state prosecuted the case with unyielding vigor, establishing that racial insults in civil society would be met with custodial punishment. Yet when incendiary racial rhetoric echoes across public platforms or within the halls of state institutions, public accountability often dissipates into legal ambiguity. Instances where private commentators or public figures have engaged in extreme derogatory discourse have frequently concluded with symbolic apologies rather than custodial sentences. This evident inconsistency fosters a growing public perception that the law operates with two separate scales of measurement, one that strictly disciplines the private citizen and another that excuses or accommodates political actors operating near the levers of power. This tension between constitutional free expression and state accountability sits at the very heart of the national debate surrounding Malema hate speech. Under Section 16 of the South African Constitution, freedom of expression is explicitly protected as a foundational pillar of democracy. However, that protection excludes propaganda for war, the incitement of imminent violence, and advocacy of hatred based on race, ethnicity, or gender that constitutes incitement to cause harm. For years, legal battles have traversed the Equality Court, the Supreme Court of Appeal, and the Constitutional Court to determine whether radical political rhetoric crosses the threshold into unlawful incitement. When legislative leaders employ provocative language that targets racial minorities or dismisses the historical contributions of multiracial struggle veterans, it deepens social alienation. Rather than healing the profound structural wounds inherited from the past, such rhetoric risks turning historical grievances into permanent instruments of political division. This breakdown of social cohesion is occurring against a backdrop of alarming socioeconomic distress. The optimistic vision of the Rainbow Nation, once celebrated globally as an extraordinary triumph of peaceful transition and human dignity, is buckling under the weight of systemic economic decline. More than 28 million South Africans now rely on monthly social distress and support grants merely to secure daily sustenance. The expanded unemployment rate has climbed past 42%, with youth unemployment reaching an astonishing 60% across major urban centers. For millions living in overcrowded informal settlements where municipal infrastructure and essential public services have deteriorated the spectacle of political elites trading insults while drawing multi-million rand salaries and commanding 3 billion rand in VIP security protection, generates immense public disillusionment. The promise of liberation was economic empowerment, universal justice, and human dignity for all. Instead, poverty has expanded to levels where 3 times as many citizens face severe economic precarity today as in prior decades. Pause for a moment and share with us in the comments where you are watching this broadcast, from whether you are joining us from across the United States, from throughout the wider African diaspora, or from any other corner of the globe. South African Dynamics would like to express our deepest gratitude to every single viewer who values fearless, independent political journalism, and we send you our most heartfelt wish. May truth guide your understanding, and may dignity hope, and peace walk beside you and your family on every road ahead. Yet the destabilizing impact of this political and social polarization is no longer contained within the borders of South Africa. As the domestic coalition of power undergoes its most volatile realignment in modern history, the international community, foreign investors, and key Western powers are watching with growing alarm. How do global diplomatic institutions and major international observers view this intensifying internal strife? And what does it mean for South Africa's standing on the world stage? The political tremors echoing through South Africa Parliament cannot be separated from the historic, seismic shift that redefined the nation's political landscape. In May 2024, for the first time in 30 years since the historic dawn of democracy, in 1994, the African National Congress lost its outright parliamentary majority. The subsequent formation of a fragile government of national unity forced traditional rivals into an uneasy coalition, fundamentally altering the dynamics of legislative power. In this volatile environment where governance hangs by a narrow political thread, the ongoing Julius Malema controversy has become an international focal point. For global observers, international financial institutions, and foreign diplomatic missions, the rhetoric inside the National Assembly is no longer viewed merely as domestic political theatre. It is scrutinized as a critical barometer of the Republic's institutional stability and constitutional resilience. From the corridors of Washington to financial capitals across Europe, international policymakers watch South Africa with growing circumspection. As a leading industrialized hub on the African continent and a prominent voice within international multilateral forums, the nation's internal cohesion carries profound geopolitical weight. The central struggle currently defining the state is one of unity versus fragmentation. When legislative privilege is weaponized to advance racial polarization, it directly undermines foreign investor confidence, complicates bilateral trade negotiations, and damages international diplomatic partnerships. Across the Atlantic, the American public, particularly seasoned observers within the African diaspora who looked to South Africa's peaceful transition as an enduring global beacon of racial reconciliation and moral triumph, views these deepening fractures with profound concern. Every recurring Malema race row reverberates through international media, sparking rigorous foreign policy debates regarding the resilience of democratic institutions and the future of constitutional governance across Africa. Furthermore, the persistent erosion of public discourse has fueled contentious international discussions regarding legal accountability and equal protection under the law. When political figures appear to operate above legal reproach, while racial tensions are stoked from the legislative floor, international human rights observers and foreign legal scholars question whether the constitutional promise of equal dignity is being compromised. In an interconnected global economy that demands legal predictability and social stability, the normalization of unchecked political animosity places the economic future of the entire republic at severe risk. Can a fractured coalition government preserve the foundational integrity of the Constitution, or will institutional compromises push the nation towards an irreversible political impasse? The ultimate test of South Africa's constitutional democracy does not lie in the combative theatrics broadcast from the legislative floor, but in the enduring integrity of its governing institutions. When inflammatory political rhetoric systematically replaces structural economic reform, the entire republic is cast beneath the shadow of institutional stagnation and social exhaustion. A modern society cannot build industrial vitality, attract sustainable foreign investment, or restore civic confidence when lawmakers consume the national agenda with divisive personal animosity while millions of ordinary families endure rolling infrastructural crises, severe water shortages, and generational poverty. Democratic maturity requires that constitutional boundaries be enforced with absolute impartiality, ensuring that no political title, no historical affiliation, and no parliamentary seat is permitted to stand above the universal standard of human dignity. The road ahead demands an unyielding commitment to institutional renewal and sovereign responsibility. If South Africa is to reclaim its rightful stature as an economic and moral colossus on the African continent, its political leadership must recognize that authentic liberation is never achieved by degrading fellow citizens or converting historical trauma into electoral leverage. Genuine liberation is demonstrated through disciplined governance, constitutional fidelity, and the transparent expansion of economic opportunity for every community. Navigating this pivotal crossroad requires profound moral clarity from both civil society and the state, not silence, not noise, truth. The future of the Republic hinges upon whether the nation can transcend destructive factionalism and rebuild a shared civic covenant founded upon equal justice, uncompromised integrity, and human dignity. Before we move into our final reflection and deliver the verdict of history, let us pause together. What you have witnessed today is not merely an isolated political confrontation in a distant chamber. It is a profound case study in how fragile democratic accountability becomes when constitutional duty is compromised by the powerful. If you value this standard of rigorous documentary analysis and believe in independent journalism that illuminates the realities mainstream narratives often obscure, subscribe to South African Dynamics right now. By subscribing, you choose to walk alongside us, supporting a dedicated platform that honors truth, defends human dignity, and holds power accountable across the globe. And when the theatrical fury inside the parliamentary chamber finally falls silent, what ultimate verdict will history deliver upon a political class that chose racial confrontation over the solemn duty of national renewal? In the final reckoning of constitutional history, the enduring measure of any true democracy is found not in the combative rhetoric of its most pugnacious politicians, but in its unwavering defense of universal human dignity and the rule of law. For over 30 years, the world has looked to South Africa with profound reverence, witnessing a historic transition that dismantled systemic oppression to establish a constitutional order grounded in equal justice. Yet, when legislative immunity within South Africa Parliament is transformed into an unassailable fortress to disparage the identity and historical sacrifices of fellow citizens, that sacred covenant is placed under immense strain. The intense legal and civic debates surrounding Malema hate speech cannot be dismissed as routine political theatre. When left unaddressed by constitutional bodies, every escalating Malema race road deepens societal fractures, deflecting national attention away from the severe economic hardships, crumbling public infrastructure, and generational unemployment confronting millions of everyday families. True leadership is never validated by the capacity to demean or alienate. It is defined by the moral courage to preserve institutional accountability, civic cohesion, and equal protection for every citizen, regardless of background. If legal double standards are permitted to flourish under the guise of parliamentary privilege, the persistent proliferation of Malema hate speech will inevitably compromise the moral authority and sovereign promise of the entire republic on the global stage. As South Africa navigates this defining chapter in its democratic evolution, we are left with an urgent question that history demands we confront. If power changes hands, but not structure, has anything really changed? What is your perspective on this crucial constitutional debate? Share your voice in the comments below, and thank you for standing with South African dynamics.